Good morning. I'm Bob McKenna, President and CEO of the Virginia Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, and on behalf of the CNU Wason Center for Public Policy and the Peninsula Chamber, I'd like to welcome you to the Peninsula Insiders Post-Session Legislators Panel. First of the year for 2020 and the first ever done virtually. This was originally scheduled as an in-person event for March 25th, and for obvious reasons, we had to postpone it. But we're here with you today, and we're very happy that you could all join us. So thank you for joining us. So a quick review of the technology. I'm sure that all of our viewers today are very well experienced with Zoom meetings by now, so this is no different. If you have a short lag in your video, I'd recommend giving it 30 seconds or so to see if it catches up. If it doesn't resolve itself, you probably should just leave and then sign back in. If you have any technical questions during the event, you can direct them on the chat function to event support. Now I'd like to thank the series sponsors: Virginia Health Services, PB Mayors, Newport News Shipbuilding, Abbott Realty, Riverside Health System, and Town Bank. And today's presenting sponsor is Town Bank. And it's my pleasure to introduce Executive Vice President for Town Bank from the Virginia Peninsula, Bert Bateman. Bert has worked for Town Bank for 18 years. He served our community as an elected official for 24 years. He has served on the Wason Center Board and currently is an active board member for Soundscapes, the Virginia Living Museum, and the Southeastern Virginia Alzheimer's Association. Over to you, Bert.
Bob, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm representing Alexis Swan, our Peninsula president, who couldn't be here today. Town Bank's pleased and proud to sponsor this all-important panel discussion, and we'd like to thank Tommy and Emily and Sia and Monty for their time they're giving to us today. We thank the Chamber and the Wason Center for Public Policy for their role in keeping us enlightened, promoting consensus, and helping us all hopefully make better decisions. Next, I'd like to turn it over to my friend Quentin Kidd, Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Christopher Newport University, and the Director of the Wason Center for Public Policy. Good morning, and Quentin, take it away.
Thank you, Bert, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Let me just give a really quick backdrop. There's been so much happened since the start of the year. Let me just summarize where we are with the General Assembly at this point and put it into a larger context. It's been, in my mind, an historic General Assembly session for a couple of reasons. When the General Assembly convened on January 8th, I would be willing to bet, I'm not a betting person, but I'd be willing to bet that there wasn't a single member of the General Assembly who was thinking at that point pandemic, health crisis, etc. It was January 9th when the first news media report came out of China of this new virus, and it was January 11th when China reported the first death from what we now call coronavirus. So in January 8th, when all the delegates and senators were getting together, this was probably the last thing on their minds. By March 8th or 9th, depending upon how you account for the closing moments of the General Assembly session, Virginia and the nation were in full pandemic crisis mode. Everybody was shutting down or near shutting down. In that time period, the General Assembly came together to create or craft a new 2-year budget for the Commonwealth of Virginia. There were 1,200 laws passed, new laws passed, and the other historic element of this session is that this is the first time since 1994 that the Democrats have controlled everything, both chambers of the General Assembly and the governor's mansion. And so as a result of that, some of those bills that were passed and ultimately signed or revised somewhat by the governor were things that many Virginians couldn't imagine passing out of the General Assembly session. In fact, I always joke that in 2008, Virginia seceded from the South when it voted for Barack Obama, and no other Southern state did. And I think legislatively, this session was when Virginia legislatively seceded from the South. A minimum wage bill was passed that will ultimately move minimum wage in parts of Virginia up to $15 an hour, or potentially could move minimum wage to $15 an hour. Marijuana decriminalization, it's now a civil penalty as opposed to a criminal penalty. Driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants, they're not legally called driver's licenses, but that's what they are, they're driver's cards. The Virginia Clean Energy Act, which essentially would move Virginia off of carbon energy production in the decades to come. Gun control legislation that would have never passed in recent years. Legislation that allows local governments to decide whether they want to keep or move Confederate monuments out of local jurisdictions. And then probably the thing that most separates Virginia from the rest of the South in some ways is collective bargaining rights for local government employees. These are just a handful of bills that were monumental and historic that came out of this session of the General Assembly. And then on April 22nd, during the reconvened session, everything was about the pandemic. The governor delayed the enacting of many of these pieces of legislation. The governor expressed the need for a lot of caution when it came to new spending. And as the General Assembly came out of the reconvened session, everybody was thinking not just about creating a new budget, but about what the pandemic's impact would be on the current budget. And so I think that is the backdrop is essentially one of crisis in some ways, but the contours of the crisis are really unknown. We don't know what the final fiscal impact of all this is going to be. And I don't know that we'll know that over the immediate few weeks. It'll take several months probably to know all that. So with that as a backdrop, let me turn it over to Marissa Porto, who's going to moderate the discussion. We all know Marissa as the past publisher of the Daily Press and the Virginian Pilot, but what's occupying all of her time right now is a new podcast series called We Virginians that you can find on YouTube. And Marissa is also an executive resident at Hampton University, and is active in the community in ways as important as she was when at the Daily Press and the Virginia Pilot. So Marissa, let me turn it over to you. And I don't think you're muted, Marissa.
Thank you, Quentin. That's kind of you. Let's get started with introductions today. First on the introduction list is Republican Senator Tommy Norman. He was elected in 1992. He represents the 3rd Senate District, which covers the counties of Gloucester, New Kent, King and Queen, King and William, part of Isle of Wight, part of James City County, part of Surrey County, part of York County, and parts of the cities of Poquoson, Hampton, and Suffolk. He's a member of the Committees on Commerce and Labor, Finance and Appropriations, and Judiciary Rules. He's also the minority leader of the Virginia Senate. Welcome, Senator Norman.
Good morning. It's very nice to be with you.
It's good to have you. Our next panelist is Democratic Senator Monty Mason. He was elected in 2016. He represents the 1st Senate District, which covers parts of York County, James City County, the city of Williamsburg, and parts of Hampton, Newport News, Williamsburg, and Suffolk. He is a member of the Committees on Agriculture, Conservation and Natural Resources, Commerce and Labor, General Laws and Technology, Privileges and Elections, and Rehabilitation and Social Services. Welcome, Senator Mason.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for having me on.
Democratic Delegate Marcia Sia Price was first elected in 2016. She represents the 95th House District, which covers part of the city of Newport News. She is a member of the Committees on Health, Welfare, and Institutions, Privileges and Elections, General Laws, and Public Safety. Welcome, Delegate Price.
Thank you. Don't forget I have a little bit of Hampton.
Delegate, we'd hate to forget Hampton. Delegate Emily Brewer was first elected in 2018. She represents the 64th House District, which covers the counties of the counties of Isle of Wight, Surrey, part of Prince George, and part of the city of Suffolk. She is a member of the committees on general laws, communications, technology and innovations, and appropriations. So welcome, Delegate Brewer.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get started with our first question, and it's a big one. We'll start with redistricting. Virginians have indicated that they want to see an end to partisan gerrymandering. Advocates have been pushing for a change to the Virginia Constitution to empower a commission to draw federal and state lines. And during the past session, the General Assembly passed SJ 18, which amends the Constitution to establish the Virginia Redistricting Commission. The last step is to let voters decide through a referendum. Will you vote to support the constitutional change in the fall? Why or why not? And we'll start with the statesman in the room, Senator Norman.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be with you. This is a subject that is near and dear to me, both from a policy standpoint and from a political standpoint. It was an interesting voyage that the constitutional amendment took this year. The Senate, as it has done in the past, dispatched the bill fairly quickly and with some ease. It has been a bipartisan effort in the Senate for a number of years. I have advocated it and voted for it, I believe, every time that it has come up during my career in the Senate. We did have a little bit of issue when it got over to the House of Delegates. And for some reason, the Speaker of the House wanted to hold that bill hostage for a while because there seemed to be a change of reflection on some members of the House of Delegates who had previously supported it. Ultimately, we were able to get the bill back to the Senate with the amendments and get it passed. I think a lot of times when we talk about redistricting or gerrymandering, we're not exactly sure how pervasive it is. I was reminded as you were reading off the number of localities that I represent, that is a classic case of redistricting. And the good thing is it gave me a wonderful opportunity to make a lot of new friends in 13 jurisdictions. And I certainly appreciate the good work that my friend and colleague, Senator Mason, does. But it really was the first occasion in our parochial area where the city of Williamsburg and James City County were split. So we're making progress, and I'm hoping that Virginians will overwhelmingly support it in the November election.
Senator Mason, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, ma'am. Well, just since I've been involved in politics, this has been something I've focused on. Senator Miller and who I succeeded, and I met in Newport News my first year to walk through the importance of nonpartisan redistricting. We still have some work to do on a criteria bill, I think, to make sure it's fair for everyone and that no one gets left behind and everyone is properly represented at the table as we move forward in this effort. But yes, I've been supportive of this the entire time. I often remind Senator Norman that I had nothing to do with taking the city of Williamsburg away from his district. That's worth reiterating at this point. But yes, I'm fully supportive. I look forward to working with our colleagues on the House side to try to make sure we have a fair movement forward for criteria. And I expect, based on the Wason City's Center's long-term polling, that it should and will pass overwhelmingly in Virginia this year.
Okay. Delegate Price, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I am unequivocally against Senate Joint Resolution 18. And if you follow me on any of my social media channels, or if you tuned in at all to Daily Press or Richmond Times-Dispatch, you can see why I appreciate the mention of Senator Miller, because I remember very early in not just my career as a delegate, but getting involved in local politics. He was someone that I definitely looked up to, and I appreciated my first year when he would come by and talk with me. But when we mention our past, we have to tell the full story. What Senator Miller was fighting for was complete independent nonpartisan redistricting. What the organization and advocates that have come to be the voice for this issue first started out fighting for was complete independent and nonpartisan redistricting. And that's not what we have in front of us. I had the honor of representing the 95th district, which was just struck down in 2019 as an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. And so when I talk to constituents in my area and I talk to my 101-year-old grandmother, 2019 was the first time in a very long time we can remember being able to vote in the 95th district or whatever it was before we had single member districts, that it was a fair election for us because we have been gerrymandered for so long. And I was in those back rooms and I was in the discussions where some of my colleagues on the same side of the aisle were willing to trade political gerrymandering for racial gerrymandering. And so I am wholeheartedly for independent, nonpartisan or bipartisan redistricting. But when you have legislators at the table, whether it is them looking out for themselves or them even looking out for their values, there is a level of selfishness that happens when we end up trying to divvy up our voters, when I really and truly believe that we are supposed to be selected by them. And I will say, you know, oftentimes opponents of my position will say parenthetically, well, it's not perfect, but we have to work on it to get it better. And I will just say in closing that African-American voters are in that parentheses. We are the ones that need to be protected, especially in today's world of voter suppression. And this amendment does not do it. I think we need to get it right before we put it into the Constitution. But we did get House Bill 1255 passed, and that does make political, racial, and prison gerrymandering illegal.
All right, well, thank you. Delegate Brewer, do you have anything you would like to share with us on this topic?
I do. I've always been supportive of redistricting reform, and I think it's really important. You know, the voters get to pick us, we don't get to pick them, and I've always felt that way. But, you know, I represent a very rural district, and prior to the partial change for last year's elections, I represented 7 localities, and now I represent 4. And I'm sure with all of the changes to Virginia's population, once we know the results of the census, that may change again. But oftentimes rural areas have really been used as a chopping block in the past when people do redistricting. Up until last year when those changes were made, there were 4 delegates and 4 senators alone that represented the city of Suffolk. So what does that mean? Everyone thinks that means you have 8 different voices for you, but when you're split in so many different directions, those people don't have a strong enough voice. And so when we carefully consider redistricting, we also have to think about what representation means to communities that are alike, and making sure that we're not stretching districts in areas that are very, very large. And so particularly representation in rural areas is going to be very important to me to make sure also those voters have a voice as well.
All right, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I'd like to get into some individual questions now. So I'll start with Senator Mason. You supported 2 key pieces of legislation in support of business in 2020. Would you bring us up to date on offshore wind energy and the Association Health Plans bill?
Well, so yes, I'd love to. The offshore wind is something that I believe that is incredibly important to us from an environmental stewardship perspective, but also from an economic development opportunity for Virginia, Southeastern Virginia, and the Port of Virginia. You know, where else is there a fully mature industry and supply chain somewhere else in the world that does not exist in the United States? And that's offshore wind. In fact, you may have seen the first turbines, or maybe the stanchion, has come to Canada. And then we'll have to have an American vessel go up and get it, because you can't have a foreign ship operating in the United States of America in old World War II rules. So, you know, right down to ships that put these wind turbines in place, an unimpeded port with no obstruction up top, deep access, and our location on the mid-Atlantic. Just an enormous opportunity for us to build a supply chain, entire new industries. Long since before I've been doing either of these jobs, people have talked about diversifying our economy in Southeastern Virginia and on the peninsula. This is an enormous opportunity for us to be a leader, and at the same, but do not underestimate, Senator Norman Seat constantly made the point that these things cost way more money. This is the most expensive, offshore wind. no question about it. We take issue with some of the numbers used, but it will cost a good deal of money to put these things in place and then generate the electricity. But I think it's a great opportunity for us to build an industry in Virginia and also promote renewable energies, which I think should be our future. Interestingly, my consortium benefits plan has gotten mixed up with association plans all along the way. A great deal of, the AARP said I could charge seniors 5 times more. The Commonwealth Institute worked very hard against it, saying that there was no guarantee to return overage. The consortium benefit plan is by nature not an association plan because it cannot just insure one person or one family. It is 2 to 50. And that's why the Chamber of Commerce has been pushing so hard for it. And unfortunately, the administration continues to say that it dents the marketplace, but by nature, again, the marketplace is designed for one person or one family to come and get insurance. This is designed for organizations, Mason Industries, that has 2 to 50 employees that would take advantage of a larger pool of 25,000 or so people, set a benchmark for insurance rates, and then drop down into the smaller pool that may be your company of 13 people that would then work off the initial rate. So the governor put a reenactment clause on it. We turned that down in the Senate. The Senate's overwhelmingly supported it. It was on the way to overwhelmingly support in the House and ran into some hiccups down the stretch. Even a handful of congressional members sending a letter saying, don't pass association plans. And once again, I can't stress enough that a consortium benefit plan is not that. I supported Senator Barker's bill because the way I got to this issue, where realtors came to me and said they needed help. Senator Barker's bill is an association plan because it gives the realtor, the independent contractor, the ability to get that insurance. Interestingly, 2 or 3 years ago, a bill was signed by this administration that allows the independent, the single person, to get insurance. And so that ship's already sailed. So the governor has another chance to take a look at that. We've sent him letters and we've talked to he and his staff extensively. And so we're very hopeful that that he'll see his way through to allow that to take shape. But we still wait for that. But I'm extremely excited about the opportunities for offshore wind. And despite the fact the offshore wind office has been delayed because it's new money, I think we need to continue to drive forward with what is just an unprecedented opportunity for our area.
All right. Thank you, Senator Mason. Delegate Burr, you were a co-patron on legislation regarding the research and development tax credit. How will that contribute to Virginia's economy in the defense and biomedical science sectors?
Well, let's talk kind of about Hampton Roads very specifically. So for a long time, I know a lot of people that are on this call, we've talked about creating opportunities for mega regions, especially between Hampton Roads and Richmond. And I know many stakeholder organizations from groups like VEDP to local economic development councils have really talked about finding unique ways to really market our area and work on creating that mega region. So while I think this will have a great benefit to regions like Northern Virginia, I also think this may be an opportunity for our region to really market moving into that mega region, whether it be from the peninsula, south side, all the way up to outside the Richmond metro. So I think every time that we add something like this, we're putting more tools in the toolbox for Virginia to be successful.
All right, thank you. Delegate Price, let's talk about the minimum wage legislation. What are your thoughts about the increase in minimum wage legislation that was introduced versus the legislation that was actually signed by the governor?
Yeah, so I was proud to support House Bill 395 because of the conversations that we were having in the House. It actually incorporated 2 of the bills that I had put forward. One, to continue to chip away at the long list of exemptions that allow for employers to not pay certain workers a minimum wage. And that was domestic workers and those working for businesses that have 1 to 4 employees. So very, very happy that those 2 provisions got included and what ultimately passed. But I think we have to look back in order to see how truly historic this was. And I think one of the lessons really is that we have to do the right thing, even if it's little by little, the entire time, so that we won't have to do what people perceived as a big jump to correct a mistake that we made. When we did not increase the minimum wage steadily over the last couple of decades, then we put ourselves in a position where families are not able to have, like a head of household can't have one job in order to pay all of the bills. They have to have several jobs. And that really impacts the family structure. So we have generations of children that are growing up as latchkey kids, or worse, they have parents that can't make time to get to parent-teacher conferences, or can't be like my parents were, at the kitchen table making science projects with me. And so I really think about the amazing childhood I had. And it's not fair that certain kids get that, but not others, because people have to work multiple jobs in order to simply make ends meet. So I was happy to support what I felt was a good compromise. I know that I had great conversations with the tourism industry and business owners about how a jump to 15 would negatively impact them. So I supported the phased approach. And then there were conversations about regional approaches, which estimates showed that that would have Hampton Roads in a very bad position. And so I was adamantly against that. And so I'm glad that we got it passed. I reluctantly supported the extension from January 1st to May, with the understanding that it was possible that the entire bill could get vetoed. But one thing that I want to point out is a lot of economic development conversations and a lot of the how will we get out of the post-COVID economy revolve around businesses. And I think that Virginia can be pro-business and pro-worker, but we have to be intentional about it. And I think that as we're talking about bailouts, as we're talking about stimulus funds, $1,200 for an individual once during this pandemic is not enough. They need livable wages, not hazard pay, but hazard-free environments to work in. And I think that's the direction that we need to continue to go in.
All right, thank you, Delegate. Senator Norman, one of the biggest policy decisions facing the Commonwealth is to retain or eliminate the right to work law. Would you expand on the value of the legislation to business?
Thank you very much. I adamantly resisted what I considered assault on Virginia's right to work law. It's really interesting to me as I have looked at the transition from Virginia being the old Dominion to what some are characterizing as the new Dominion. It's very curious to me the number of pieces of anti-business legislation that were advanced and frantically passed in the 2020 session. Delegate Price talks about looking back in history. As you look back in the history of the business of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have always been ranked as one of the #1 states to do business in America. Especially here recently, we were selected as the #1 state to do business in America. We've been recognized as the #1 state for corporate relocations. A verification of that is the fact that we were able to land Amazon. I do have to scratch my head in wonderment as to whether or not we would continue to be as successful and enjoy those recognitions and land economic development prospects like Amazon if we had passed these pieces of legislation several years ago. I am very much of a laissez-faire, free economy individual. Assaulting Virginia's right to work law based upon our history, certainly I don't think is going to help us. I'll be very interested to see after this pandemic situation calms down, which is certainly going to have an impact, I think, on business ratings in the next year. But once that calms down, to see where Virginia falls with the legislation that's been passed, attacking Virginia's right to work law, going with minimum mandatory wage, pushing mandatory family leave in certain businesses. These are all great social and progressive issues, but I think we have to be very mindful of what is that going to do to impact Virginia's economy. And I think everyone on this phone call, excuse me, on this video can agree on one principle. And that principle is it is literally going to take years for Virginia's economy to recover from this pandemic situation. Those of us who live in Hampton Roads, and especially having the privilege of representing the historic Triangle, our businesses have been devastated. They rely very heavily on tourism. And I do not think that once we move into phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3, that there is going to be the surge of rush of reattendance and reparticipation in tourism. So I think there were some very myopic business decisions that were made, including attacking Virginia's right to work law.
Thank you, Senator. You brought up the pandemic, so we'll move into some questions about COVID-19. In light of the pandemic, the governor has proposed the General Assembly has accepted a pause on new spending in the budget that begins July 1st. Once the Commonwealth is able to forecast revenues, what spending priorities would you recommend and what cuts would you advise? And since we just left the conversation with Senator Norman, we'll start with you and we'll work our way through all of the panelists.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. For a number of years, I've had the privilege of sitting on and participating on the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. And up until 2020, I was a co-chair of that committee. It's a little scary when you've got an English history major who is involved in a multi-billion-dollar budget, but I've learned an awful lot through osmosis on it. I think we've got to move forward very deliberately. I was pleased that we belatedly hit the pause button on some of these budgetary issues. The legislators on this call are certainly aware that Senator Newman and myself in the Senate back around March the 8th said, let's don't move forward immediately on this budget. Let's hit the pause button till we really see what the impact of this pandemic situation is going to be. A decision was made to move forward on that budget. As a result, we were confronted during the reconvened session with a number of amendments that the governor was forced to make as he looked at financial situation in Virginia. I think priorities, public education, K-12 needs to be a priority. Regardless of your gender, your orientation, your ethnicity, we need to continue to educate Virginia's youth in the absolute best way that we can. It is that education that affords these young people an opportunity going forward, and it helps to make them independently sustained. So education has got to be a priority. I think we've got to continue to look at mental health reform. Senator Creed Deeds out of Bath County has been a real advocate on that. We've made some progress, but we still have a lot of ground to cover on that. I think is when it comes to cuts, that's a little more challenging. You know, you constantly hear the refrain, well, you need to cut the budget, you need to reduce spending. The only problem is they always want the budget of someone else to be cut. Don't touch my budget. It's all right to reduce the size of that budget, but don't mess with mine because mine is the holy grail. So go and find it somewhere else. Or I hear the refrain frequently from some Republicans that talk about the bloated budget. I think it was a little aggressive this year on the biennium budget. It appeared that there were those who wanted to spend every dollar that we could. Maybe things appeared to be much more enlightened and rosy at the point in time that discussion was going on. But if you listen to what Secretary Aubrey Lane has said about the pandemic impact, we could easily be looking at a $1 to $2 billion shortfall in revenues as a result of taxes not being paid for a whole variety of reasons. So I think we need to continue to be very, very measured. Blessedly in 2021, all of us on this video will have the opportunity to participate in amending the two-year budget that we adopted. And I expect that those amendments are going to result in some reduction in spending. I think we've got to put greater emphasis on stopping the proliferation and the growth of various agencies. I think we need to continue to keep our eye on higher education. They're under enormous fiscal stress. and we constantly hear about tuition and fees. But there's some areas that we can look at also in human services. We just need to be discreet and deliberate about it.
Thank you, Senator. Delegate Brewer, do you have anything that you'd like to add about cuts in the context of the budget as we reimagine it in the pandemic, after the pandemic?
I think you probably used the appropriate word when you said imagine. I think that we're really in a phase where we're learning and growing and understanding what the possible outcomes are going to be on the other side of COVID-19, but we're not quite there yet. So we have to think about what we see happen in our localities and how things are really going to look different. We see our restaurants locally that aren't contributing, meals tax locally like they would have at prior junctures. We have, hotels tax, or what some localities call bed tax. We're going to have a lot of localities that are struggling. I think that in an unprecedented fashion that we're going to have to really grapple with and understand. But education has to be a top priority going forward with the budget. We've learned more about what our education field can sustain, withhold, or where they need assistance really and truly during the midst of this pandemic. So I think that's something we will take and learn from this. But I think it's a bit too early for us to truly talk about where we would spend and where we would cut until we really have the total picture of how small businesses have been hurt, who may be closing, how school districts have been affected. So I think we're still in a learning phase, to be honest, about where we may land on what changes we may make to the budget.
Mm-hmm. Delegate Price, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that as we're still focused on trying to save lives, that it is a little premature to talk about specific cuts. But I think we can talk about perspectives. One of the perspectives is what the federal government can also be doing. And so I've talked with Congressman Scott and heard from Congresswoman Loria what they're trying to do at the federal level. So when you have, a CARES Act provision that gives localities funding based on having a population of 500,000 or more, Newport News Mayor McKinley Price is looking around like, but wait, and so that only one locality out of our Commonwealth was able to be directly helped with that. And so I am interested to seeing what the COVID response from the federal level will continue to look like as it helps states, because for us to bear the brunt of a potential $2 billion shortfall and the cuts that it's the low-hanging fruit that actually gets chopped the first. And I just want to say that the perspective that I'm taking into this pandemic has really shown a light on even more of the inequities that happen within our Commonwealth. And so I want to make sure that we protect not only the current funding, but look at maybe increasing funding for the quote unquote least of these in our society, those that need even more protection as we are moving into a post-COVID or potential second wave of this pandemic. And so we need to keep people and their physical health also a part of the conversation while we're talking about the economy.
Thank you. Senator Mason, Senator Norman mentioned two things I know are high on your list of priorities, higher education, and he also mentioned higher education and healthcare. And
Right.
In the context of cutting the budget, where do you, or pulling back a little bit, where do you think you are at? Feel like we need to focus our attention as we move forward?
Well, thanks, Marissa. I was one that did not want us to press pause on the budget. I wanted us to move forward as we did. And here's why: because we have had solid leadership across party lines from the past. Senator Norman, Senator Hanger running the Finance Committee, Chris Jones running the Appropriations Committee. We have conservatively budgeted over the last 2 years and built a foundation to be as prepared for this as you humanly could be, right? When I came to the Senate, I saw Aubrey Lane speak to finance, and we had $235 million in a rainy day fund, not even close. Going into this budget, we had $1.8 billion because we kept building it up, and we're trying to put another $600 million in this year. So I wanted us to move forward because I believe we had done the best we could foundationally to prepare for something that no one knows how to prepare for. I watched it. I didn't get the ability to watch the Appropriations Committee this year, but they seem to have done a fine job. But our Finance Committee didn't change a beat. I mean, we changed chairmanships, but we had bipartisan leaders on the subcommittees, and we continued with the same teamwork approach coming out of finance that I've seen since I've been on the Senate side. And that's why I thought that we should move forward. Of course, we want to look as soon as we get back and see. And by the way, I don't think in the next 60 days we're going to have any better view if we'd have to go back and institute a budget for July 1. It was extremely painful to watch $2.2 billion be unallotted. And I think it's going to be super hard to decide what to reallot. But, raises, it's $83 million in pre-K 3 and 4-year-olds in there. The Governors Get a Job, Give Back, and Get Skills, Get a Job, and Give Back program was cut. Emily and I have done a lot of work on the child welfare system. We had like $43 million to give raises to social service professionals at the local level. So yes, the re-benchmarking this year and the raises we tried. And as Senator Norman says, I've been, one thing that I've been more involved with that I never anticipated was mental health. I may even try to do some jockeying to see if there's change on the Deeds Commission, if I can get there, because I have had so many conversations with our CSBs during this process, with the Eastern State and the struggles and the challenges that they're seeing, and how do we continue to deliver the services that don't stop. Just because there's a pandemic, our CSBs are on the front line of mental health work every single day. And so so I don't know how long it's going to be. And, I assume we'll be back August, September to see how bad these revenues really look. And I think it's going to be bad, but how we move forward, there are a lot of good things in this budget. And I think I really was very supportive of the budget and realized why when I watched painfully $2.2 billion be unallotted for future review.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Norman, the governor recently issued executive orders reaffirming the existing code language that provides immunity and protection for healthcare workers. Do you support strengthening immunity provisions, and what areas are of concern to you?
Thank you very much for the question, because I have very early on had reached out to the administration suggesting that they immediately move forward on extending immunization or what we'd call tort immunity to the frontline healthcare workers, and even consider some other first responders. With my other hat on in my profession, I pretend to be a trial lawyer, so I have some familiarity with the litigious nature of attorneys across this country. And I was concerned that even during this pandemic crisis, that there would be individuals who were going to file lawsuits against hospitals or first responders or even employers who, unbeknownst to them, a worker would come in and be infected and perhaps also end up infecting a client or customer. I was pleased that ultimately the governor and the administration did extend that tort immunity to the frontline healthcare providers. I just wish they had moved a little quicker. And I get emails every day from the National Trial Lawyers Association. They just give you the captions of cases, and it has been interesting the number of lawsuits that I see that are already being filed, particularly in some of those areas where the frontline healthcare workers are not being protected. So I'm pleased that we're there.
Okay. Are there any other industries or organizations that you feel like might be asking about that? I know I was in a conversation maybe last week about folks who are interested in that immunity process for private universities in Virginia.
I think one of the challenges when you make a decision to provide that immunity to one category or one group of workers, then you immediately hear a hue and cry from other industries or other areas or segments of our economy who are requesting that the same benefit be extended to them. The very problematic issue is where do you draw the line on that? You can't do it universally on it. I certainly think that we've taken the frontline healthcare workers and at least on a temporary basis have protected them. I think we need to look at some other first responders and see whether or not we need to extend that to them as well. I mean, you see police officers on the street who are stopping individuals for traffic violations, and they're trying to maintain the 6-foot distance between the individual. They have masks on, they have gloves on. Very difficult for them to execute the responsibilities of their jobs. I'm surprised we haven't heard some from, say, the meatpacking industry, where it has been absolutely horrendous, but at the same time, on a federal level, there's great pressure to have those meatpacking industries up and producing again because of the shortages in the stores. So I think we've got to be deliberate on it. We've got to measure each request very carefully and very deliberately and weigh it. And I'm sure we're going to hear more.
Thank you. Delegate Brewer, we talked a little bit about higher education, and just briefly, I'd like to ask you what concerns you might have about the financial well-being of K through 12 education in Virginia.
Had any concerns to where we're at with the COVID crisis. You know, the way American workers are working going forward may totally change. We may have 1 or 2 parents teleworking. We may have the possibility of parents now homeschooling. We may have one parent staying at home, choosing to provide childcare and maybe homeschooling as well. I think that we're going to see a lot of changes come fall when students return to school about what that population may be. One of the things I think was most important though that was done this year, very specifically, we talked a little bit earlier about mental health and why that's so important, but we can't forget children when we talk about that. This year, Dolores McQuinn, a delegate from the Richmond area, did a wonderful bill that I was actually in the conference report for, to increase the number of guidance counselors that are in school. So I think one of the most important things we did this year was making sure that we addressed having quality, concerned, leadership in schools for students. I think that's number one priority, and making sure, especially, in areas that I represent, that, children don't go home hungry. I think that's of prime importance as well.
All right, thank you, Delegate. I'd like to ask one last question to the room, and that is whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the initial legislative session, was there a piece of legislation that you felt like stood out other than the ones that we spoke about today? So maybe we can start with you, Delegate Brewer, since you've already answered the last question.
Sorry, I had to unmute. So for me personally, one of the things I've been working on, Senator Mason, I actually co-chair the Foster Care Caucus in Virginia. And so I'm a bit partial to this, but the Fostering Futures program that we were able to get done this year was so vitally important. Oftentimes children in foster care, when they age out at the age of 18, they don't have that support system like normal children do. And so it wasn't really talked about a lot. We had a lot of other hot button issues this year. But the Fostering Futures program is going to provide gap services to kids that are between 18 and 21, provide them additional support as they're trying to navigate their future in adulthood and possibly attending college, and just learning how to live independently on their own. And so while it's probably not the top of mind for so many things that were questions today, I think it's one of the most important pieces of legislation that Senator Mason and I worked on this year to really get across the finish line, and also work on making sure that we're able to support the next generation equitably.
Thank you, Delegate. Senator Mason, did you want to jump in here and speak to any other legislation?
Well, I mean, there's so many monumental pieces of legislation this year that it's hard to pick one. But one that I think was very, very positive, but also needs our continual attention and review is the Clean Air Act, the Clean Economy Act. I mean, that is a behemoth of a bill that looks at to solar energy, incorporated our wind energy, renewables in the future, reduction of power, and reliance on fossil fuels. And I think it's a very, very positive step. It was an enormous bill. But I think we also need to continually review what we're doing and how we're going about it. This was my first year on Commerce and Labor. I saw a number of people come through, and here, Dominion has become everyone's favorite whipping boy. And so, we just want to be able to do this. Okay, well, this is not at all deregulation, say 20 people that are lined up behind the lectern. Whoa. It absolutely is a partial deregulation, says the next 15 people lined up behind the lectern. So I think Senator Norman was involved in some effort like this years ago. But as we move forward on our effort for renewable energy and the change in the future of energy policy in Virginia, I think we have to have a very considered approach, and we have to study in the off season, what do these things really mean? Because when I have, distinguished experts saying A and then distinguished experts saying Z in front of me at 7 o'clock on a Monday night in committee, that's not the place to make the call. We need to have these long-term conversations between sessions as we lay out things that are both good for the energy provider that we have and good for our future and future renewable energy opportunities. And those decisions aren't often made best, with a 30-minute testimony in front of a committee. So I hope we'll continue to work for that, to be beneficial to all of our goals and objectives.
Thank you, Senator. Delegate Price? Do you have any suggestions here on pieces of legislation that you feel like passed this session that stand out for you that we haven't mentioned here today?
Yeah, so I was glad to work with a piece of legislation that had originated from Senator Jeremy McPike. Last year, we passed an emergency bill to help public federal workers that had been furloughed as the session was happening during an actual furlough. And that was an emergency bill that kind of helped push back or push off evictions while people were in the middle of their furlough. And then it expired in September of 2019. So I worked with the stakeholders, and we got a bill that would have extended those provisions and put them permanently in place for any future furloughs. And so we were really proud about the work that we did with that. And it turned out that it was a really good vehicle for the governor to make an amendment. And we all got together and talked about, well, this looming evictions that were coming from the pandemic, how can we use this bill? And so the governor, his team, and I worked on the same provisions being available for anyone that has had a loss of income due to the COVID pandemic. And so, for instance, if you're a tenant, within 90 days of the end of the state of emergency, you can get a 60-day stay from an unlawful detainer. And if you're a homeowner or a landlord, you could get a 30-day stay from going into foreclosure. And so it gives us a little bit more time for once we start to come out and reopen to go on and start remaking some money so that we can have fewer evictions and keep people in their homes, keep them safe, and then also keep property owners, keep their property in their hands.
Thank you, Delegate Price. Senator Norman, I'm going to wrap it up with you. I'm going to ask you, what are you hearing out there from your constituents about their concerns over the COVID-19 pandemic?
I am hearing a great deal, as I'm sure everyone on this call is hearing from their constituencies. Where I'm hearing most of the calls are from the small business persons. Once again, because Senator Mason and I represent the historic Triangle area, we're highly dependent on tourism. The restaurants are getting absolutely slammed. The loss of revenues, how they are going to bring their the employee force back after this. It's just terrific concerns on that. I'm also hearing from small businesses. It was interesting. I got a phone call yesterday from a smaller business, and they had laid off of their employees with the expectation that they would hire them back. And they've gradually started to bring them back. Well, they had a call from one of their former employees yesterday who was furious with the company. And he was furious because they were calling them back to work. And he said, right now I can stay home, draw unemployment, get $600 a week, and I'm making more staying home than when I will come back to work. And you want me to come back to work now? So it's really the dynamics that you're hearing out there are very unusual, but it's your small businesses, your restaurateurs, the hotel industry is just getting killed. And not just in the historic triangle, but all through Hampton Roads. If you read the report from the Dragus Center at Old Dominion University, they're talking about how the precipitous fall in heads in the beds on the south side of Hampton Roads in Norfolk and Virginia Beach. They're down just unbelievably. Many of the hotels in Williamsburg are shut up and are anxious to reopen. And that's the other part of the equation, is the impatience of reopening Virginia and restarting our business. And once again, trying to balance those health concerns that Delegate Price has been talking about so much, trying to balance those health concerns against the business concerns. And we can't be irresponsible, but it is a very, very difficult balancing point to determine. No shortage of phone calls, no shortage of impatience.
Well, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us today, and thank you for answering all the questions that I've asked you today. I want to just remind everyone who is watching that today is Give 757 Day, and folks on the Peninsula Community Foundation that I've worked with in the past, the food bank, the Girl Scouts, all those folks are, and many more, are all in need of us, particularly now in this time of a pandemic. So
That's right. GiveLocal757.org. Go there.
Help your neighbors, right? Help your neighbors, help yourselves, help the community. And on that note, Tom?
All right. Well, thank you, Marissa, and thank you to the lawmakers and their staffs for working with us to make this virtual panel possible today. I know we're all learning new technology, so this is very helpful, and I think it went really well. Just as a reminder, this conversation was recorded, and both the Peninsula Chamber and the Wason Center will post it to our websites once we finish up today. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors again. Your donations to the Wason Center support the on-campus jobs of over 100 students that work in our survey lab. You know, they are going to need these jobs now more than ever, and we all need the work they do to produce the independent and data-driven insights that the Wason Center provides as we all make decisions about opening our businesses and responding to the pandemic. So Bob mentioned that this is a breakfast series. This is the first of, you know, our planned 4 events for the year. Our next event is to host another breakfast on campus as usual. If we can't host it on campus this summer, we'll do another virtual panel. So, you know, look forward to that. And so I will just thank everybody again and hope everyone stays healthy and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.